Hello and welcome back. This is the week one lecture. So I would like to jump right into our week one material. I've already posted a lot of this in the week one overview. So if you've already watched the introductory video, you know by now that you need to check out all the stuff I post each week in our web campus module. So hopefully you've had a chance to do that. So now I want to run through this stuff sort of again. I will repeat some of the material that's in the overview, but it's good that you hear this multiple times because what we're talking about here in week one, these are really sort of foundational concepts and techniques that we're going to be using throughout the semester. So it's important that we get comfortable with them now. We need to master them, early on so we can use them and they can benefit us throughout the semester. So we're talking today about the differences between passive reading on one hand and active reading on the other. So one thing I would like you guys to do before we really get started, go ahead and open up the first reading assignment of the semester. So hopefully you've seen this PDF. It is posted in the week one module. It's simply called Reading Sources. And there's a Reading Sources Part 1 and there's a Reading Sources Part 2. Now you might notice that Part 2 is our week 2 reading. So I've already posted it just so you guys can see it, and if you want to get a little bit ahead, you can go ahead and check it out. But the only required reading assignment for week 1 is part 1 of Reading Sources. So I like to print my stuff out because I'm old. You guys don't have to do that. You can just save these files, and it would be good if you could open them up when you sit down to watch lecture. So I'll be talking about a few things in this first selection. So you'll notice this is how most of our readings are going to look. There'll be parts of textbook chapters that I've saved over the years, and I'll provide the readings like this. So keep that handy as we get started. So let me go back to what I was saying. The difference between passive reading and active reading. So what do I mean by that? Well, passive reading is something that we are all probably familiar with. We all probably do this sometimes. So I like to reenact this scene. It doesn't work as well in a lecture recording. It's better when I'm in class. Hold on, give me a second. Because in order to do this accurately, I need my phone. So I want to try to simulate the way that a lot of students probably read a lot of their assignments or research for school. So we're reading, but we're perhaps reclining. We are perhaps relaxing. We're often looking on our phones, right? We might be talking to our roommates or family members. We might have multiple windows open on our computer. So while we are technically reading, we're also doing about 3 or 4 other things at the same time. So you don't need me to explain this very much. You can sort of get it. A lot of times we are distracted when we sit down to read for class. So that's what we mean by passive reading. Yes, you are reading, technically. You are looking at the words on the page, and there might be some kind of basic comprehension going on, but when you're not paying full attention, when you're distracted, when you're doing 4 or 5 other things, you're not going to remember very much of what you read. You might understand it at the time, but studies show that if you're not concentrating at a certain level, or if you're not recording or at least committing some of this to memory, it's going to go away. Whatever you do comprehend is going to go away in a few days. And once we start researching, I think you guys will see how that can be a big problem. So if you're reading an article in a passive way, an article that you find as part of your research, and when you read it, you sit down and read it in that sort of passive way that I just acted out very expertly for you. If that's how you read it, and then you wait several weeks, maybe even a month or 2 before you're actually using it in the process of writing your research paper, you're not going to remember it. Whatever time you spent reading it 3 weeks ago or a month and a half ago, it's almost like it never happened because you're not going to retain any of that information. Humans are actually quite bad at retaining information. A lot of us think that we have good memories. I like to claim that I have a good memory, and I do compared to other people, but even people with good memories, we forget more than we remember. And that's especially true with reading, with texts. A lot of us are better as sort of visual learners if we can see things sort of acted out, or if we can see things in video form, or it's just something on a screen. But reading is hard to remember what we read. So part of what we're doing in 102 is we're trying to become better readers along with becoming better writers. And I'm trying to get you guys ready for the research that you're going to be doing soon. So that means that you need to become active readers. If you really want to get the most out of your research, and if you really want to remember, understand, and then be able to use the stuff that you read, you need to become active, not passive. So today we're going to talk more about how to become active, and really there's just 3 key strategies that you need to learn and get comfortable with. None of this stuff is very difficult or complicated. These are just habits. These are habits that you need to form as you read. So I'll just go through these. Like I said, this is all this information is in the week 1 overview. So you'll have it in written form and you'll have it in lecture form. So you should feel good by the end of this week about all of this stuff that we're covering. So let's start with underlining, because we don't need to spend a lot of time talking about that. It's pretty simple. And then I want to spend a little bit more time talking about annotating, and then we'll wrap up with asking questions. So, when you guys are reading for pleasure, when you're reading just in your leisure time, in your free time, reading stuff online, reading a book for fun, I don't necessarily think that you have to do all of this stuff all of the time. But you need to do this stuff when you're reading for school. Because when you're reading for school, the expectations are higher. You're not just doing it for fun, you're doing it in order to accomplish some school-related goal. And I'm going to expect a certain level of understanding from you, right? I'm going to expect that you can demonstrate to me that you understand and are capable of summarizing or at least discussing what you read. So these strategies are important because in school, passive reading can get you into can present problems. In your normal life, passive reading is probably fine. But in the academic context, you need to be active. So underlining. We do this in order to really emphasize the most important parts of an article or a book chapter, whatever it is that we're reading. So pretty self-explanatory, pretty logical, right? You don't want to underline everything, of course. That sort of defeats the purpose. You want to pinpoint the most important parts. So the most important words, maybe the most important sentences. What you're doing is you're trying to distinguish the most essential elements or the most interesting parts of the article, or the things that you want to talk about, the things that are most interesting to you, or simply the things that seem most important to you. And the reason that this is good for multiple reasons. Number one, it will help you when you go back later to possibly reread parts of the text. Now, I know most of us don't want to do this, but this is part of research. Sometimes you might need to return to an article or a book chapter that you read several weeks ago, but you need to refresh your memory a little bit, or you might be looking for one specific piece of information that you're going to be working with in your paper or in some other assignment that we're doing that's related to the paper, to the research paper. So in situations like that, when you go back to a document that you've underlined, where you've employed underlining, again, don't underline the whole thing, but when you go back, you'll be able to pinpoint some of those most important parts. So that way, you don't have to read the whole thing again. You can go back and maybe reread certain sentences or maybe even a paragraph or two and pick out the most important stuff that you need, the stuff that you are actually going to use. So again, use this for selection and emphasis. And a few things that often are very important, parts of articles and books that you might want to sort of zero in on will often be the topic sentences that appear at the beginnings of paragraphs. Often they might announce some important point or idea that the author is going to be exploring in that particular paragraph. So we use topic sentences as writers, and many professional writers use them too. Not always, but when they do, those are often good sentences to underline, because by checking out a topic sentence, you might not have to read that entire paragraph to at least know what the paragraph is about. And that might help you at some future date. So you can underline topic sentences. You should usually underline what you think are the main ideas of a particular article or whatever text it is that you're reading. No matter what form they come in, or no matter where they're found, if you come across something that seems really important to the author, and you can usually tell, right? Like if the author is repeating this idea or phrasing it in slightly different ways, but it's essentially the same idea, you can pretty much assume that's important. If the author spends a lot of time on that idea, multiple paragraphs or multiple pages, then you know. Let me underline this idea. Even you don't have to underline it every time it appears, but if you underline it once, that's going to help you to remember it, and then you can do some more stuff later on, and you'll remember that idea, and you can come back to it. So underlining is simple. It's an easy way to help you remember, and it kind of helps you get started on the comprehension process. You can also underline things that maybe you don't understand. You can, we're going to be asking questions too as part of our active reading strategy. So you can really underline almost anything. There aren't really hard and fast rules about what you can or cannot underline. But I'm just giving you a few things to look for. So I said topic sentences, main ideas, also examples. If you see helpful examples that illustrate whatever point or claim the author is making, you might want to snag an example or two, underline them. And also transitional places in the text where the author might be shifting gears or moving into different subject matter, or maybe the tone changes. And we'll talk more about that in the weeks to come as well. So I typically am an underliner. I don't know if you guys can see. This is my own marked up copy of the first week's reading. You can't really see that. I underline stuff all the time. I use this strategy. But some people like to do circling instead of underlining, or some people like to use a highlighter. Any of that's fine. Some people use brackets to put important sentences or words in. All of that's fine. Like I said, there's not a lot of rules when it comes to active reading. These are just things you need to do. Do them in whatever way helps you learn. Do this stuff in whatever way is most beneficial to you. So that's underlining. Okay, that's pretty simple. Let's move on to annotation. Now, this might be a word that some of us were not familiar with prior to week one. And if you haven't looked at the module yet, you might still be unfamiliar with it. This is kind of a big word, and it's going to be an important word for us because we are later doing annotated bibliographies. I won't worry you with that right now, but eventually we are doing that. But for now, I want us to think of this simply as a form of note-taking. So when I talk about annotating, I just mean take notes while you read. It's a very simple concept, but a lot of people simply do not do it. So this is what I mentioned, I think I said this at some point in my introductory lecture. I want you to read with your pen in hand. That's really what annotating and underlining is all about. This is active reading, right? Because if I'm writing, if I'm underlining, if I'm kind of working at recording some notes while I read, I can't really do all of those other things that I was doing back when I was reading passively, right? I'm not really looking at my other windows. I'm not talking to the other people. I'm not scrolling through my phone. I'm actually more engaged and more focused on the text that I'm reading. So those of you who took me in 101, a lot of this stuff we talked about in 101 because it's very important to me. Uh, and I know that a lot of students just don't do these things because they seem to add extra work and extra time. And to some extent that's true, but it's time well spent. So if you guys want to see an example of what annotations look like, flip over to page 5 in the part 1 of reading sources. Look on page 5, kind of near the bottom of the page. You see a paragraph that we are reading. We're pretending like it's a source or it's something that we found and we need to make sense of it. And you see the annotations written in the margins. That's typically where they go. So these are typical types of, student annotations. So you see the kinds of things that are written here. A few questions, a few observations. You notice that he's kind of summarizing some of the ideas that he's, coming across in this paragraph. I think he does a little bit of definition maybe at some point. He's kind of doing some comparison, but he's just making observations largely. But you see a question or two, you see general observations, and he's trying to make sense of this paragraph. So he's also underlining and circling, and he's writing notes. He has annotations in the margins. So that's what they look like. That's really all they are. They're often very informal. They're going to be fragments oftentimes. You're not necessarily, you don't have to write your annotations in complete sentences. I mean, you can if you want to, but that's certainly not really a requirement. Typically, these are just comments or questions. They can be summaries. They can be explanations. They might be definitions at times. You can really write down anything that helps as you're trying to understand the text. So I often ask questions when I'm reading something difficult or new or complex that I'm not familiar with. I might ask questions. I'm going to write down what I think the author means at certain pivotal moments, stuff like that. Again, there aren't really a lot of hard and fast rules, but you can see examples. I think they might show you some more. Yeah, so we're getting to this a little bit later on, but over on page 11 in this same PDF file, you'll see more examples of annotations, underlining, circling. These are just really basic skills that college readers simply need to possess and need to use. Because again, a lot of the texts that we're going to be reading later as we get moving on our research, these are going to be difficult texts, complicated. You cannot commit them all to memory. So again, those passive reading ways are no longer going to cut it at this level. So yeah, that's pretty much all I need to say about annotations. But just remember, you can kind of form your own sort of personal shorthand style. Like I said, these are informal. These are simply for you. They are strictly for you. I'm never going to grade you on your annotations. So you can find whatever style works for you. I often abbreviate words, and I'll put just like a W/ instead of with. I have my own little shorthand system that allows me to write faster. And you guys might develop that too. You can shorten words. You don't have to write in complete sentences. Again, these aren't for anybody else. They are simply for you. They help you to remember, and they help you to understand. So the final thing that I wanted to mention is simply asking questions. And this is something that, it seems obvious as maybe a part of the reading process, but a lot of students are hesitant to ask questions, both, in terms of asking themselves questions, but also asking classmates or their instructor. So obviously we're not in a live class setting, but a lot of the stuff that you read is not going to be immediately, it's not always going to be 100% clear 100% of the time. So there might be situations where you want to ask me questions, but at the very least, you need to write down questions as part of your annotations. So again, there's a lot of different ways you can do this, but asking questions allows you to engage and connect with what you're reading, just like all of this stuff does, because all of these strategies force you to think about what you're reading. And if you come across things that don't immediately make sense to you, or if you come across words or references to certain events that you're not familiar with, or people that you're not familiar with, you should ask questions about those items. And again, you can write these in the margins as part of your annotations, or you can wait until you're finished reading and you can jot down a few questions at that point. It really doesn't matter, but these are things that you might want to look into. So if you're coming across people or events or words or phrases or terms that you don't know, you might want to look some of those up. And more often than not, you can figure them out simply through just by using a Google search. So you might need to ask some questions that you can later answer yourself after you poke around a little bit. But there might also be questions that you're stumped on, and you might want to bring them to me, or you might bring them up. You might mention something in a research journal, or of course, you could just email me. We can talk at some point. But you need to be willing to ask questions. It's okay if you don't understand everything about what you're reading immediately. Now, most of our textbook readings that I post are going to be pretty easy to understand, but I'm talking about your own research. Once you start doing your own research, you're going to have to sort of work through some of the sources that you find. They're not all going to be easy to understand. So that's when asking questions is important. And just one final thing I want to mention, again, it's in the overview, but it's important to remember, and I'm going to talk about this in future weeks, and I'm going to just be assuming that you guys know what I mean. There's sort of two levels that we have to be aware of when we're reading complex texts. There's the micro level, micro, think small, and then there's the macro level, the big picture. And we have to be attentive to both of these levels. So the micro level means really paying close attention to individual words and sentences. And again, if you don't understand certain words and sentences, underline them, ask questions, jot down some things in the margins that might help you along. So it's important that we're paying attention to the micro. But we also have to pay attention to the big picture. Like, what is this text about? What is the overall point? What is the overall purpose? The overall meaning? We need to be aware of both levels. And again, it might take some work to be able to understand both levels sufficiently, but we can't get too caught up in the micro, because sometimes if we're only paying attention to individual sentences without thinking about the big picture that the article is trying to express, we might take certain sentences or ideas out of context because we might forget the larger meaning that they are working towards. And on the flip side, if we're only paying attention to the macro, we're going to miss stuff. Like, we know the overall point, we know the big argument that's being made, but because we're not paying attention to the micro, we're missing maybe a lot of important supporting ideas, or we're missing a lot of the details, a lot of the examples, a lot of the support that we're going to need to be familiar with if we're actually going to talk about this source. So in the future, you're going to have to summarize sources, you're going to have to analyze sources, you're going to have to use sources in various ways. So if you're reading actively, you'll be able to do all of those things. If you're reading passively, it's going to be a struggle. So hopefully this all makes sense. Just remember, underlining, annotating, and asking questions. Those are the bedrock active reading strategies that I'm expecting you guys to use throughout this semester. And again, when you're on the beach later on after the semester's over, you can go back to the passive style. But in 102, we have to be active really at all times. So I have a little practice for you guys, and you can do this on your own time, or you can do it as soon as you turn me off. But if you look on pages 8 and 9 of the PDF, you see a couple of excerpts from longer works. So you have one called "To Save Everything, Click Here." To save everything, click here. And then you have one called, it's an excerpt from something called Glamour. Okay, so these are, short excerpts, a couple of paragraphs in one case. The second one from Gundel is just one paragraph. So these are short, but I want you guys to kind of practice some of what we were just talking about. So just do a few things. This won't take long. When you're ready, sit down and read both of these selections. Just read them. The first read through can be with pen down, and you can just get comfortable with the text. Sit down, read, get a general idea of the macro. What are they about? Okay, what are they saying? All right, that won't take long. They're both short. Okay, but do remember the glamour piece runs on to the top of page 10, but there's just a few lines there on page 10. So once you've read them the first time, go back and read them a second time, this time with your pen, and do all of the stuff I was just talking about. Underline, annotate, and ask some questions. And I think you'll notice the difference. Once you've gone through them that second time, you're going to feel more confident about them. And if you have a few questions that you're curious about, do a quick Google search. I guarantee you, at least in the glamour piece, you're going to come across names and maybe a few words that you don't know. So just look them up. Just punch them into Google and get some quick answers to a few of your questions. And that's all you have to do. But it's not a long assignment. It's just an easy way to see how these strategies really do work and how they look and how the whole process goes. So let's try that, and I'll have some more practice for you next week when we tackle part 2 of reading sources. I have another activity where I'm actually going to ask you some questions about an essay that we're going to read next week. And I want you to use these strategies to help you answer those questions. But that's for next week. For week 1, just make sure that you're familiar with all of our stuff. You've looked at the syllabus. Make sure you've completed the week 1 reading. Do the little practice activity I just gave you. And then the final thing for this week is our first research journal entry. So you guys should notice in the week 1 module, I've posted something called Storm Area 51. So this is a short article that I believe originally appeared in The Atlantic or some other news magazine. With an online presence, of course. The reason I picked this, I've used it a couple of times. It's a little bit old now, but I use it because it's about a real event that took place in southern Nevada maybe a year ago. I think it was in 2019, maybe 2018. I won't say much more because it's kind of a fun article. It's short, it's easy to read, but again, I want you guys to practice all of the stuff that we just ran through. So take a look at the Research Journal number 1, week 1 assignment. It's already posted. The directions are in there. So click on the link, read the directions, read the Area 51 piece. Again, it's short. It'll take you 20 minutes, maybe no more than a half an hour, even with all of this stuff that I want you to do. So yes, you'll be underlining, you'll be annotating. You might ask a question or two. There might not be a lot of questions to answer once you finish reading, but run through all of these strategies for the Area 51 piece. That's a short, easy piece. But once we get comfortable doing this stuff with short, easy pieces, we'll be able to do the same kind of work with the more difficult, complex texts that we're getting to in the near future. So let me know if you have any questions. Email me if anything's unclear. But remember, I want that first research journal entry completed by the end of week 1. Okay, so let me know if you have any issues or problems with the article or the assignment, and I will see you next week.